Like all good crime stories, this starts with a body, or at least a place where a body used to be. It starts with something missing, an absence, and an absence that requires some kind of explanation. What's missing in this story is actually the start. Where does Irish, and particularly Dublin, crime fiction start? Now, it seems like a funny question to ask almost, because there's so much Dublin and Irish crime fiction around at the moment. I mean, just, look at the pile around me here. And if you go down to your local library, you will find lots of books on, of Dublin crime fiction. In fact, I probably should start this with a bit of a disclaimer by saying that if you're a reader of crime fiction and over the next 45 minutes or so I manage not to mention your favorite crime writer, or indeed if you're a writer of Irish crime fiction I manage not to mention you, please don't be offended because there's just so much. I mean, we're in the midst of a fictional crime wave at the moment that I couldn't possibly mention it all. So really what I'm going to try to do here is just draw on a few books to give us a sense of the way in which Dublin imagines itself through crime fiction. And that involves starting at the start. Now, often when people are talking about Irish crime fiction, they say, okay, where does Irish crime fiction start? One of the people who often gets mentioned is Ken Bruin in Galway, who's been writing crime fiction now for over 30 years, has published a lot of Irish crime fiction. And probably, the novel he starts off with, Funeral in 1991, sometimes is pointed to as the first kind of modern Irish crime novel. It's a good place to start. But it's Galway. And I think we could probably go back earlier. So if we're going back to the origins of Dublin crime fiction, I think we need to look elsewhere. One place we could go is go back actually a bit further to the 1920s, to Liam O'Flaherty's novel, The Informer, published in 1925. Now, The Informer is a novel set during the Irish Civil War, but in some ways it's a crime novel. And O'Flaherty thought it was a crime novel. Here he is writing to his editor, Edward Garnett, in 1924. He said, "It should appeal as a shocker, thriller, to the public that reads detective stories and murder stories." Interesting how he's looking for the right term, a shocker. No, a thriller. And there's a sense in which a lot of O'Flaherty's works actually are kind of like crime novels. The Assassin, which was basically inspired or based around the assassination of Kevin O'Higgins, is effectively a kind of crime novel. That's The Assassin's 1928. The Puritan, 1932, which deals with the sort of puritanical ethos of the Irish Free State, basically centers around a character who is murders a prostitute, a character named Frances Ferreter, a truly evil character. Once we start to think about somebody like O'Flaherty then as a crime writer, a whole vista opens up in terms of thinking about Irish literature and crime writing. The book that comes to mind immediately is in fact what is often considered one of the most important, or certainly one of the most studied and read novels of the 19th century in Ireland, William Carleton's The Black Prophet from 1847. Now, the reason this novel has had so much attention paid to it is it is the main novel written about the Irish famine, the Great Irish Famine of the 1840s, that was actually published during the famine. It was published serially in the Dublin University magazine in 1846, then as a full novel in 1847, and was actually read during the famine. Now, that's what's kind of given its legacy. But the thing that I always find strange about The Black Prophet is that, in fact, it's a murder mystery. Here's a scene early on. A character named Nellie is going out to dig for dandelions. Nellie found a little soft green spot covered with dandelion and immediately began to dig it up. The softness of the earth and its looseness surprised her a good deal, and moved by some unaccountable curiosity, she pushed the spade further down until it was met by some substance that felt rather hard. From this, she cleared away the earth as well as she could and discovered that the spade had been opposed by a bone. On proceeding to examine still further, she discovered that the spot on which the dandelions had grown contained the bones of a full-grown human body. Now, that sounds like the beginning of a crime novel to me. But the strange thing, and the thing that makes this such a strange novel in some respects, is that this is a murder mystery that is set during the famine, when literally hundreds of thousands of people died of starvation, cholera, typhoid. And while one doesn't want to weigh the value of one life against another, it's hard to develop a kind of narrative motive, if you like, or a narrative energy around a single murder in the midst of all that death. So there's something strange about this as a murder mystery. I could go back even a bit further, back to 1829, to another of the novels of the 19th century that has had a huge impact, or had a huge impact in its time, Gerald Griffin's The Collegians. Story of a wealthy young man, Hardress Cregan, who marries a young woman from the cottages, very different social class, and then realizes he's made a bit of a mistake, or his family make him think he's made a mistake, so he murders her. That was actually based on a true story. Story of a woman named Ellen Hanley, whose body washed up in Kilrush, County Clare in 1819. And she was from a humble enough background. She'd been having a relationship with a man named Stephen Sullivan. And Sullivan was eventually caught, tried, and in 1819 executed for her murder. So we have a real murder, the murder of Ellen Hanley, which in turn leads to the novel, The Collegians, which eventually becomes the play, The Colleen Bawn by Dion Boucicault. So there's a sense then in which there is a kind of history of Irish crime writing. But both of these novels have a feature that make them quite different from the crime writing of today. The Collegians is about social class. It's about the big house, the cottage, the landowner, the people, the tenants who live in the little cottages that the landowner owns. The Black Prophet is about the Great Irish Famine. These are about the big issues of Irish history: land ownership, famine, all those kind of big national issues. And crime writing, at least modern crime writing, typically doesn't concern itself with those things. I go back to something that one of our most exciting and important crime writers today once said, John Connolly, and he's talking about how he began writing. And he says, as a young writer, I could think of few subjects with which I wanted to engage less than the nature of Irishness or the Irish situation. And now, as a slightly older writer, that position has not changed. So, when John Connolly started writing in the 1990s, he decided to set his novels anywhere but Ireland. And so most of his novels, particularly the ones featuring his detective Charlie Parker, are set in Maine, where Parker lives. Occasionally, Parker leaves Maine and goes elsewhere in the States. The Dirty South, for instance, he goes to Arkansas. But these are very much American crime novels. Character who drives a Ford Mustang and is named after an American jazz musician. So there was a sense in which if you started out writing crime fiction in the 1990s, as John Connolly did, that earlier tradition, that thing that was there beforehand, novels like The Black Prophet or The Collegians, wasn't really available to you. You had to make it up. And in John's case, you had to go somewhere else. So I'm still looking for that missing body. I'm still looking for that missing origin for Irish crime fiction. And where do we find it? Well, I think I'm going to look at a real crime. Perhaps one of the most famous Irish crimes. In the summer of 1982, a young nurse from St. James's Hospital, Bridie Gargan, was brutally killed in the Phoenix Park. And shortly afterwards, a farmer from Enfield in County Meath, Donald Dunn, was shot with a shotgun that he owned himself and was selling in his own field. This prompted panic, of course, and a search, a manhunt, and eventually a man was arrested, Malcolm MacArthur, and where he was arrested was almost as remarkable as the events themselves. He was arrested in the home of the Attorney General, Patrick Connolly. Now, this is probably the most famous Irish murder case of the last century. Even in the past year, there were two really good books on it. One, Mark O'Connell's A Thread of Violence, made up of interviews with MacArthur. And another, Harry McGee's The Murderer in the Taoiseach, which kind of looks at the politics of the whole situation. It also gave us a word in our vocabulary, gubu. Grotesque, unprecedented, bizarre, unbelievable, as the Taoiseach at the time, Charlie Hoy, described the whole situation. The whole thing was gubu. How could a murderer, and a murderer who committed such vicious crimes, end up in the home of the Attorney General? It seemed like this particular murder would tell us something about the nature of Irish society, about the nature of power, about the nature of how power interacted with crime, who we were as a people. And not with reference to the past, not with reference to the famine or the Civil War or any of those great historical topics that Irish fiction had felt it had to engage with in the past, but with here and with the now, and to a large extent with the city. Because that's the other thing that makes novels like The Collegians or The Black Prophet not terribly useful as a way of thinking about the starting point for contemporary Irish crime fiction, because they're both rural. They're both set in the countryside. And while there is certainly crime fiction that's set in the countryside, by and large, contemporary crime fiction is an urban phenomena. It happens in cities. And in fact, you could almost say that the puzzle that they're not just Irish crime fiction, but the crime fiction in general is trying to solve is in some ways the puzzle of the city. How do all these human beings inhabiting the same space, how do we all live together? How do we interact? How does all this good and evil, virtue and vice swarm together in the same streets? The writer who first picked up the story of Malcolm MacArthur and the murders that he committed is John Banville. And we can see this actually in his notebooks, which are lodged in the archives in Trinity College in Dublin. In June of 1986, he started one of his notebooks, and John Banville typically writes his novels by hand, very elaborate longhand, very beautiful actually script in these nice hardbound notebooks. And he starts writing in 1986, and he starts writing about the nature of evil, the nature of crime, the nature of transgression. And then you can suddenly see a voice come to him. And this is the beginning of one of the notebooks. My lord, when you ask me to tell the court in my own words, that is what I shall say. I am kept locked up here like some exotic wild thing, last survivor of a species they thought extinct. I'm surprised they don't bring parties of school children to view me, svelte and dangerous, padding back and forth behind the bars. My terrible glare. Now that's the beginning of the novel that becomes the Book of Evidence, with the character Freddie Montgomery in prison, svelte and dangerous, padding back and forth behind the bars like some sort of wild animal. The narrative, the novel itself, the narrative of the novel is a fairly thinly disguised version of the Malcolm MacArthur story. In some ways it's very much its own thing. With this character, Freddie Montgomery, who sort of aimlessly, living a kind of aimless life, becomes obsessed with a painting that some friends of his family own, decides to take it, just to take it. Steal it's not even the right word, he's just going to take it. And when a maid confronts him, he kills her, puts her body in his car, drives off, dumps the body, and then doesn't know what to do, throws the painting away, and then ends up in the home of a friend who is a senior civil servant. Very much like the Malcolm MacArthur story. One of the things that happens in this novel, though, is that there's a long period where Freddie has committed the murder, but he hasn't been caught. And so he's wandering around Dublin, and the city where he's lived all his life suddenly seems unfamiliar to him. This is from the Book of Evidence itself, from the novel itself. Freddie's describing walking around the city. The air was a poisonous blue, hot blue haze. I had become unused to cities. Yet I was aware that even as I struggled here, I was simultaneously traveling smoothly forward in time. It seemed a kind of swimming without effort. Time, I thought grimly, time will save me. Here's Trinity, the bank, Foxes, where my father used to come on an annual pilgrimage with great ceremony to buy his Christmas cigars. My world and I an outcast in it. What a great line. My world and I an outcast in it. What crime does typically is to take the individual who has committed the crime and to make them an outcast in their world. And paradoxically, when the focus is, as it usually is, on the detective is also something of an outcast in that world. So typically in the crime novel, you have two characters, both wandering around a city that we all know, like Dublin. Those points of reference, Trinity, College Green, Foxes used to be the cigar store there in the corner. All these very, very recognizable locations that somehow or other look strange, look different, look transformed. This, in lots of ways, is a kind of keynote of the crime novel or the crime fiction since its earliest origins. Or stories like Edgar Allan Poe's Murder in the Rue Morgue from 1841, or Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories. So let's think for a moment about crime fiction and these parallel figures of the detective and the criminal. The French, actually originally Bulgarian philosopher Savitan Todorov once wrote a lovely essay called The Typology of Detective Fiction. And he said, basically, there's two things that we need to know about detective fiction. First of all, there's two stories in any piece of detective fiction. One is the story of the murder, which is important but absent. You start with the body, the missing body. The story that leads up to it is the missing story. And then you have a second story, which is present, but in some ways inconsequential. And that's the story of the investigation. Think of crime novels, quite often how they progress. The detective wanders around, talks to people, asks questions, gets a lead here, a tip here, a dead end there, all in the aid of building up that missing story of the crime. In fact, and this is Todorov's second point, what the detective is actually doing is the same thing that we're doing as readers, piecing together a story. So the crime novel has an equation. The detective is basically doing what we're doing as readers, and the author, who creates the puzzle in the first place and hides the clues, is doing what the criminal did. Now, this has a lot of consequences for the way we think about crime novels. One of them is that we can't help but identify with the detective because the detective's doing what we're doing. So the detective can be the grumpiest, most disagreeable character you'd ever run across in fiction. Think of Michael Connolly's Hieronymus Bosch, or think of the daddy of them all, Sherlock Holmes. Neither one of them people that you'd want to be stuck in a lift with. But we read the novels and we identify with them because they're doing what we're doing, trying to put this story together. And that's what detective fiction does. It's about putting the story together. It's about figuring it out, figuring out this world that we live in, and particularly figuring out the city. John Connolly, reflecting on his own craft, says at one point he thought one of the reasons that crime fiction took a while to take hold in Ireland is, he says, I believe there's a strong streak of anti-rationalism that runs not just through Irish fiction, but through our character as a people and as a nation. The basis of crime fiction, he says, is essentially rationalist. Intellectual and deductive reasoning is the path to truth, either uniquely or, to take an extremist view, as a matter of precedent. So there's a sense in which what crime fiction does is say, there's a way you can figure out this world we live in. There's a way in which you can look at it that it makes sense. And if a society doesn't think that about itself, it's not going to have crime fiction. So there's an argument that somewhere in the 1990s, something shifts in Irish society. The tectonic plates do a little bit of a movement. And that we move toward wanting to know how it works, of not accepting authority, whether that's the authority of the church or of the state or of anyone else, who simply say it works as it works and don't ask any questions. Instead, we start asking questions. And the fictional form of that is the detective novel. But it's not just any kind of detective novel. There are different kinds of detective novels. In fact, there are a lot of different kinds of detective novels. But I'm just going to differentiate between two. There's a kind of detective novel that actually quite often isn't set in cities, what's known as the cozy. Think of Agatha Christie. And quite often her novels are set in little villages, trains, country houses, where there is a crime. Crime creates a puzzle to be solved. But once you solve the puzzle, everything goes back to being safe, calm, and, well, cozy. You know, think of Murder on the Orient Express. Or, if you want a television example, think of Murder, She Wrote. The crime writer Raymond Chandler wrote a very influential and lovely essay in 1950 called The Simple Art of Murder. And he differentiates between the cozy, where you start with a world where everything makes sense, the murder disrupts it, the murder is solved, and go back to making sense. He differentiates that between what he called realist crime fiction, or hard-boiled. The realist, he says, in Murder, writes of a world in which gangsters can rule nations and almost rule cities, in which hotels and apartment houses and celebrated restaurants are owned by men who made their money out of brothels, in which a screen star can be a fingerman for the mob, and where the mayor of your town may have condoned murder as an instrument of money-making, where no man can walk down a dark street in safety because law and order are things we talk about but refrain from practicing. This is Raymond Chandler writing in California in 1950. It's not a very fragrant world, he says, but it is the world you live in. And certain writers with tough minds and a cool spirit of detachment can make it very interesting and make amusing patterns out of it. Chandler was somebody that certain Irish writers were starting to pay attention to through the 1990s. Jean Carrigan, for instance, was actually back in the 1980s working as a journalist, writing about crime, writing about social issues for outlets like McGill, Sunday Independent, Sunday Tribune. And he was writing about real crime cases. And at one point he mentions Chandler, he starts to write about Chandler, and starts to write his own crime novels, which I'll come to in a moment. But here's what Jean Carrigan says about Raymond Chandler. He says, Chandler's differentiation between the classic mystery, the cozy, and hard-boiled was valid then, and it remains so, up to a point. And it's true that the classic mystery was generally conservative, and the hard-boiled crime novel often challenged the cozy consensus. The classic mystery, sometimes referred to as the cozy, described the disruption of a genteel world, usually by a murder. The super smart detective assembled a list of suspects, finally zeroing in on the killer. The crime was solved, the disruption remedied, and order restored. But hard-boiled writing, says Kerrigan, and he's thinking of novels like Chandler's fabulous Farewell, My Lovely from 1940. The hard-boiled school isn't so much about a mystery, although there may be one. The crime has disrupted society, as in the classic mystery. But unlike the cozy, the hard-boiled sees this cracked, disrupted society as the reality. The cozy consensus is the sham. The detective explores this reality and is under no obligation to put things back together. And in some ways, that essay by Raymond Chandler from 1950, in conjunction with the kind of ripples of disruption that were created by the MacArthur case in the early 1980s, I think that's where I start to see the clues of what explain the origins of Irish crime writing. Because it's a fact that from the late 1990s onwards, and in fact really beginning in the early 2000s, there is an eruption of Irish crime writing. So what I want to do now is just quickly pick through a few of these writers. I mean, one of them obviously is Kerrigan himself. Starts writing crime novels with Little Criminals in 2005, moves through The Midnight Choir 2007, Dark Times in the City, short stories 2009, and The Rage in 2011. And one of the features of his fiction, and this is true of a lot of Dublin crime fiction, is the proximity of the criminals and the police. His detective, Bob Tidy, is from Ballybock in the North Inner City. In The Rage, his criminal family, fictional criminal family, I should add, the McKendricks, are also from Ballybock, where the houses look directly on the streets, no gardens, says he describes it. So you have the detective and the criminals coming from the same areas, the same streets, knowing one another, moving in the same circles. And that kind of intimacy will inform a lot of Irish crime fiction. I mean, just picking one off the shelf almost at random, Alan Glynn's Winterland, for instance. The whole plot hinges around two people, both from Tala, with the same name, one of whom becomes an influential figure in government, the other who becomes a petty criminal. And there's a hit put out on the petty criminal, and the other figure gets involved with it. One night, one name, two bodies is the tagline. So Dublin is a city suddenly that becomes very amenable to crime fiction, because there's this curious intimacy of, two worlds being brought into collision with one another. In 2003, John Gray, an editor at the New York Review of Books, sent John Banville some copies of some of the crime novels by the French writer Georges Simenon. Now, Simenon is famous for the speed with which he wrote. He wrote something like 200 novels. The story was he would write a novel more or less continuously without sleep, standing up, drinking strong coffee and smoking cigarettes. But he typically could write one in 3 or 4 days. Now, Banville himself was kind of famously slow at writing. He's not as slow as he lets on, but with his own fictional novels, there's certainly a laborious element to the writing. So he thought, I'm going to try this writing crime fiction and see does it go any quicker. And the way he describes it, the first of his crime novels that he writes, Christine Falls, published in 2007, that he was staying at a friend's house in Wicklow, and he went up to the room and started to write, and he came back and he suddenly had 2,000 words, which had never happened with his literary novels before. Now, I'm going to come back to Banville, because although he's part of this wave that kind of starts in the early 2000s, one of the features of his major crime novels, the ones featuring his detective Quirke, or who's actually a pathologist, is that they're set in the 1950s. They're historical. And that's something we're going to want to take account of in a minute. But it's just, I suppose, worth noting that there's a kind of moment in the early 2000s when suddenly crime fiction makes sense to a lot of people. The way in which Declan Hughes, who publishes a series of crime novels in the early 2000s, puts it was, he said, for a while, I felt like somebody in the 1950s with a guitar waiting for rock and roll to break out. I knew it must be possible to write hard-boiled crime fiction set in Ireland. I just wasn't sure that Ireland knew about it yet. And then a couple of things happened at the same time: money and peace. One of Declan Hughes' arguments is that while the Troubles were a kind of live conflict in Northern Ireland, it was difficult to write Irish crime fiction when there was this political situation involving murders happening. But the other thing that made it difficult was when there's not a lot of money sloshing around, the stakes are a bit lower. The classic periods of crime writing, whether we're talking about California in the 1950s or Scandinavia in the 1990s, are typically times when there are inexplicable amounts of money suddenly sloshing around a place. And Dublin in the early 2000s was certainly somewhere that there were inexplicable amounts of money suddenly sloshing around. So Declan Hughes also turns to a model, just as John Banville turns to the French writer Georges Simenon. Declan Hughes turns to what he calls his holy trinity of American crime writers: Ross MacDonald, Dashiell Hammett, and our friend Raymond Chandler. There was no native tradition to draw on, says Declan. I turned to America, not just for reasons of style or because of the evident parallels between Californian and Irish family Gothic, or because novels based on the premise that the society they dealt with was deeply corrupt resonated more than somewhat to an Irishman. Ultimately, he says, I turned to America because that was where creatively, imaginatively, essentially, I had been living all along. He said, look, I watched American movies, I listened to American music, I read American novels. I was living in America in my head anyway. So it made sense to create a detective, Ed Loy, who's Irish, has spent time in California, and is now back in Ireland. And like Freddie Montgomery, he is both at home in the city and an outsider. He's part and apart. And that is really the detective's posture, always part of their world, but not fully part of it. The American template, says Declan Hughes, suited the times. The task was to employ the American model, but to imbue it with a distinctive Irish feel. Perhaps, he says, a good analogy would be with jazz. I think we probably have enough perspective now on that period of the early 2000s, when the boom was booming and the Celtic Tiger was a new phenomena before the crash of 2008. To look back on that first 5 or 10 years of the 21st century as a period when Irish society, and Dublin in particular, was dealing with a situation that was unprecedented and new, with a kind of prosperity, an inexplicable prosperity. And I think it's one of the reasons that there's this eruption of crime writing in this period. Put the dates on it. John Banville publishes Christine Falls, 2005. Jean Carrigan publishes Little Criminals, 2005. Declan Hughes publishes his first novel, The Wrong Kind of Blood, 2006. Within 12 months, we suddenly had something that looked like not just an Irish crime fiction tradition or a Dublin crime fiction tradition, but one that had a kind of critical mass and was going to keep on running. And all of those novels, and particularly the John Banville's Benjamin Black novels and Declan Hughes's Ed Loy novels, are part of that venerable tradition of crime writing, the series, where there's going to be another novel and another novel and another novel, all featuring the same detective. The novel for me that really captures that sense that crime fiction then could deal with the Irish present as it was is Tana French's Broken Harbour, which has to have one of the creepiest beginnings of any crime novel. If you remember back to that period of the early 2000s, when developers couldn't build houses quickly enough and built them in all sorts of unlikely places. And then in the summer of 2008, the economy collapsed, the bottom fell out of it, and suddenly builders just couldn't finish things. These empty estates we started to call ghost estates. Estates where, as you went into them, you might have a couple of completed houses at the outset, and then you would get a shell of a house, a pile of bricks, some nettles, these sort of half-empty places. This is where Tana French starts her novel, Broken Harbour. As we got deeper into the estate, she says, as we got deeper into the estate, the houses got sketchier, like watching a film in reverse. Pretty soon they were random collections of walls and scaffolding with the odd gaping hole for a window. No one lived here. Jesus, said Richie in the silence. Richie's one of the detectives. Jesus! His voice was loud enough that we both jumped. The Village of the Damned. Fabulous novel. But it uses that moment in the early part of the century, just after the crash of 2008, and the kind of the empty houses in the ghost estate, and the whole situation that leads up to that, as a basis for crime fiction and for a crime novel. Tana French goes on to explore this kind of territory in a whole series of novels. In the Woods, 2007, The Likeness, 2008, Faithful Place in 2010, which is set in the Liberties and uses its Liberties setting very, very strategically, in that the Liberties for her is a kind of, it's the old part of the city where things that you thought were hidden may well come back. You won't find Faithful Place unless you know where to look. The Liberties grew up on their own over the centuries without any help from urban planners. And the place is a cramped cul-de-sac tucked away in the middle like a wrong turn in a maze. You know, this sense that there are parts of the city where the kind of old Dublin is still there and can kind of surface back up. In an interview she did, she talked about her work. She said, this is Tana French, she says, murder itself cuts across every cultural nuance, but the kind of murder is determined by the culture itself. Because of those things, crime fiction becomes a point of exploration of a society's deepest fears, of the things that it hasn't assimilated. And God knows, and she's talking here in 2011, God knows, she said, over the last 15 years, Irish society has just been avalanched with more than we can possibly assimilate in this lifetime. So there's this sense then suddenly, a sense that wasn't really there before, that all the forms of crime fiction, drawing on models from France or the United States or Scandinavia or wherever, are available to Irish writers to write about the present. And part of that is a kind of sense of liberation from having to deal with the big existential questions of what is Irishness, or have to deal with the weight of history. It's a way of thinking about who we are in the present and where we live in the present, particularly in cities, particularly here in Dublin, through fictional forms. So take a novel like, for instance, Niamh O'Connor's Taken from 2011, from that same sort of period, which starts off with a fictional petrol station based, I think, on one that's actually there. Tara Parker Trench pulled up at the only free pump in the petrol station on Eden Quay. So you can picture a petrol station on the quays in Dublin. And after a long, hard look through the windscreen wipers, killed Beyonce's ring on it and twisted around. It was 9 o'clock on a Saturday night, pitch dark, but she wasn't worrying what might happen if she left her 3-year-old son alone in the car near Dublin city centre. Not when she was only going to be gone for 60 seconds maximum, and especially not when it was lashing rain. Now, you just know that's not going to turn out well when you decide you're okay to leave your 3-year-old son alone in a car park in the dark in the lashing rain. And of course, things go badly wrong. And I never drive by the very prominent petrol station on Dublin Quays, on the Quays, which I'm sure is a lovely place, without actually thinking of her using that as a setting. That sense that there are now kind of urban spaces in the city that are like the kind of urban spaces that we are familiar with from other forms of crime fiction and crime films is something that Irish crime writers have started to draw on, and that novel does it beautifully. other issues we can start to draw on as well, and actually start to draw on them historically. Nicola White's novel, for instance, The Burning Boy, from 2022, so we're getting up to the present, is actually set back in 1986. The Phoenix Park, she says, starts off, the Phoenix Park is not a dainty park. It fans out from a point west of the city centre and north of the Liffey, a stretch of grass and trees that is not as neat as a city park, but not as wild as the countryside either. And this is the setting where a young gay man is killed. The poor lad got the lights kicked out of him, looks like. I think it's a cruising spot, says one of the detectives who's not terribly interested in investigating it. And of course, what she's actually drawing on here, again, is a real case, the case of Declan Flynn, who was killed in Fairview Park in 1982. So suddenly crime fiction can deal with not just our present, but our near past, of things that happened not that long ago, that we perhaps weren't able to write about at the time, or fiction wasn't able to deal with at the time. But crime fiction can deal with now. And that's the territory that Benjamin Black, or John Banville writing as Benjamin Black, stakes out for himself with his Quirke novels. This is one of the most substantial series of Irish crime novels, and they're set in the 1950s. And the first of them, Christine Falls, in some ways uses that sense that John Banville recognizes in Freddie Montgomery in the Book of Evidence, where we started earlier, but that runs throughout all crime fiction. That somehow or other the awareness of crime and the awareness of corruption lying underneath the surface of the city changes the way in which the detective sees the city. And there's a lovely passage, well, lovely for crime fiction, in Christine Falls, where the detective or pathologist Quirke is walking down Grafton Street. It's 1950s. They strolled down the green toward Grafton Street. People were out promenading, enjoying the last of the fine day that had started so badly. Then Quirke thought of Christine Falls, the young woman who's shown up dead, waxen and wan on the bier. Bier as in platform in the morgue. That sense, that awareness of the bodies that are out there changes the way he sees a beautiful summer's day in Grafton Street and Stephen's Green. And in some ways, that's the way the Quirke novels work. Dublin in the Quirke novels is a kind of haunted city. It's a place where you know there's something bad hidden behind the quiet facade. And in lots of ways, it goes back to the roots of crime fiction, what crime fiction does, changing our perspective on the city. But it also, of course, is going back in time. It's going back to the 1950s. And if we were to try to trace a trend in Irish crime fiction over the past decade, one of those trends, certainly, would be the emergence of historical Irish crime fiction. I mean, for instance, Conor Brady has a whole series of novels set in Dublin in the 1880s, around a detective named Joe Swallow in the Dublin Metropolitan Police. They start with The June of Ordinary Murders, 2012, The Eloquence of the Dead, 2013, The Hunt in Winter, 2016, and In the Dark River, 2018. In the Dark River starts out with workmen working around Dublin Castle. At first, the men working on the tunnel thought the bones were those of an animal. It was common enough down in the caves and fissures through which the underground river Poddle flowed to come across the remains of dogs or cats or larger creatures that had drowned in the current that flowed into the River Liffey from under the castle. But of course, it turns out this is not the remains of a dog or a cat or a Viking. This is the remains of a woman who was killed not long ago in the novel. And this is our body. This is where the story starts. What somebody like Conor Brady is doing is kind of excavating Irish history, if you like, and finding these same threads of unease, these same threads of crime, if you like, that the contemporary writers like Tana and Declan Hughes are finding in the present. And there's a whole series of these. I mean, one of them is Michael Russell's novels, the Stefan Gillespie novels, which cross over into kind of espionage fiction. City of Shadows, 2012, City of Strangers, 2013, City in Darkness, 2016, and so on. They all have city in the title. But they very, very strongly evoke a city, Dublin, that is, if you like, under a certain kind of cloud of mystery. This is City of Shadows, Dublin, June 1932. The moon shone on the Liffey as it moved quietly through Dublin towards the sea. The river was sparkling. Silver and gold flicks of light shimmered and played between the canal like embankment of stone and concrete that squeezed it tightly into the city streets. By day, the river was grey and sluggish, even in sunlight, darker than its sheer walls, dingier and duller than the noisy confusion of buildings that lined the quays on either side. I mean, this is a Dublin, just even the way he sets that image of the city, darker than its sheer walls, grey and sluggish, flecks of light coming through it. Just even the way he describes the city there sets up the scenario for a city which, as the book describes it, where there's a missing woman, 2 mysterious murders, and a city shrouded in secrets. We could also look at, for instance, Joe Joyce's series of novels, Echo Land, Echo Beat, and Echo Wave, set in Ireland during World War II, which again kind of cross over genres into the thriller or the kind of espionage novel, but are also in this world of the historical detective novel. In fact, the last book I'm going to mention also does this, and this was this year's Dublin One City, One Book novel. And that book is Andrew Hughes's The Coroner's Daughter. Now, this is a meticulous recreation of Dublin at the beginning of the 19th century. And the main character is, as the title suggests, the coroner's daughter. It gives us a Dublin in which the real danger, the real corruption, is that which wears the face of respectability. A sect in the novel who basically are this religious sect who turn out to be responsible for various things going on. But like all good crime novels, it starts with the body, but perhaps almost kind of playing on that theme, it starts with a part of a body. This is the coroner's daughter talking. For my 18th birthday, father promised me the hand of a handsome young man, and he duly delivered, mounted in a glass bell jar. I mean, her father is the coroner, so he's able to give her an actual hand of a young man. I mean, that's how the novel starts, but it evokes a kind of very, very vivid sense of Dublin as a city. It's part of this trend then that involves Conor Brady's novels, the Benjamin Black novels, Joe Joyce's novels, Michael Russell's novels, where we have historical crime fiction starting to also move in along with the crime fiction set in the present. And there's even a sense in which that old division between literary fiction and genre fiction is breaking down. I mean, one of the novels that got a lot of attention over the past year, Sebastian Barry's Old God's Time, is effectively a crime novel. It features the detective, it features a murder that happened in the past, it features that murder being unraveled. And indeed, John Banville's last novel, which he claims may well be his last novel, we'll wait and see, The Singularities, brings us back to where we started with Freddie Montgomery, the character from the Book of Evidence. And I think in some ways we are back where we started in that world of the 1980s in terms of the way in which Irish crime fiction and Dublin crime fiction asks us to think about our world. Let's think of what Raymond Chandler said again. He says, the realist in murder writes of a world in which gangsters can rule nations and almost rule cities, in which no man can walk down a dark street in safety because law and order are things we talk about but refrain from practicing. I think what Dublin crime fiction has allowed us to do is to think about those questions of law, order. What do they mean? What does it mean to live in a world where there is power circulates in ways that we perhaps don't fully understand? And I think that came as a kind of revelation in the early years of the 21st century. And that was that eruption of crime writing between 2000 and 2010. Since then, crime writing in Dublin has settled into place. It's become part of the landscape. We now have all these books and more books appearing every year. And we have historical crime fiction added to the contemporary. And I wonder, does this mean that we should be worried that Dublin is a city comfortable with crime writing? Or is it a good sign? Does it mean that at last we become comfortable with ourselves as an urban people, with all the contradictions and the discomforts that that entails? I think those are the questions we can start to ask now. So I'll just leave you with a thought from a crime writer from a different country, Stieg Larsson, a Swedish writer. Stieg Larsson says, "There are no innocents. There are, however, different degrees of responsibility."